Hello Daily Drafters and welcome to the Phyrexia All Will Be One limited archetype guide here on the Daily Draft channel. This video will cover everything you need to know to prepare for your first draft of the new set when it releases on MTG Arena on Tuesday, February 7th. We've got some poisonous new mechanics and some slick new counters that are sure to make this set full of corruption. Let's dive in. Before we hop into new and returning mechanics for this set, I'd appreciate it if you would consider subscribing to the channel if you haven't already. These set reviews take a lot of time and have to be done on a strict schedule, and I'm doing everything I can to get them to you when I know you need them. Remember, YouTube doesn't allow any content creator to make a single penny off of their content unless they have a minimum of 1,000 subscribers, so if you think I deserve to be rewarded for the content I make, a subscription is all that's needed to help the channel head in the right direction. It's absolutely free for you, so there's really no reason not to. Before we look at our first archetype for this video, let's start by quickly going over new and returning mechanics for the set. The first returning mechanic for this set is poison counters. For those of you that haven't played with poison counters yet, poison counters act as an alternate win condition. In order to win via poison, you must give your opponents 10 poison counters. If at any point they acquire their 10th counter, they lose the game. It's almost like a twice as fast way to kill them. There are a multitude of ways to give your opponents poison counters in the set that we will cover, but a quick way to make sure that they keep acquiring more is via our next returning mechanic, Proliferate. If at any point you're instructed to proliferate, you choose any number of players or permanents that already have counters on them. For each one and each kind of counter it has, add another one. Proliferate works with all sorts of counters in the set, including poison, so if your opponent has one poison counter and you're able to proliferate, you're able to give them another poison counter. The same works with +1/+1 counters and any other kind of counter that exists on the battlefield. Let's take a quick look at Mesmerizing Dose here, which is 1 and 2 blue for an enchantment aura at common that enchants a creature. When it enters the battlefield, you tap enchanted creature, and then you proliferate. That creature doesn't untap during its controller's untap step. You'll notice that Proliferate is tacked onto a lot of effects in the format and will be a key mechanic in the set with all of the various kinds of counters running around. So how exactly can you give your opponents their first poison counter so that you can start proliferating? Well, I'm glad you asked. You can do that with the new mechanic, Toxic. Anytime a creature with Toxic deals combat damage to a player, that player gets a number of poison counters equal to the toxic value for that creature. This is slightly different from the older mechanic, Infect, which dealt poison counters equal to that creature's power. Toxic is a fixed number that can't be changed for each creature. These poison counters are assigned in addition to regular damage being dealt. Again, the toxic value and the power of the creature aren't necessarily connected. Toxic has no effect if damage is dealt to another creature or a planeswalker, which is also different from Infect. And lastly, toxic values stack. If a creature has Toxic 1 and is given Toxic 1 by another ability, it will have 2 instances of Toxic 1 and will assign 2 poison counters. Let's take a look at Bilious Skull Dweller and Nimraiser Paladin here. The Skull Dweller has Toxic 1, simple enough, and the Paladin has Toxic 2, which notably is different than its power of 4. In Phyrexia All Will Be One, we now have an incentive to assign poison counters to our opponent beyond the 10 that will kill them with the new mechanic Corrupted. Corrupted is a new ability word that highlights abilities that make cards stronger if an opponent has 3 or more poison counters. Some corrupted abilities are activated and others are static. You'll also find instants and sorceries with corrupted abilities. Some of these abilities provide additional effects if you have a corrupted opponent as the spell resolves. Others affect what a spell costs or what it can target. For this mechanic, let's look at Apostle of Invasion, which is 4 and 2 white for a Phyrexian Angel at uncommon. It's a 4/4, it has flying, and it has corrupted. As long as an opponent has 3 or more poison counters, it has double strike. This is an example of a static corrupted ability, and a nice little bonus if you're able to poison your opponent just enough to turn this ability on. Our next new mechanic is Formyridin. And yes, the exclamation point is part of the name of the mechanic. Formyridin is a new triggered ability found on some equipment cards. This equipment enters the battlefield unattached, like other equipment. However, it also creates a 2/2 rebel when it enters, and then attaches itself to that 2/2 rebel. If for some reason the equipment were to leave the battlefield before the triggered ability of creating the 2/2 resolves, you'll still create that 2/2. Equipment with Formyridin behaves just like other equipment in that you can use the equip ability to attach such an equipment onto another creature that you control. Dragonwing Glider is 3 and 2 red for an artifact equipment at rare that has Formyridin. It also gives the equipped creature +2/+2, flying and haste, and has equip for 3 and 2 red. So it basically starts out as a 5 mana 4/4 flying haste that essentially dies into an equipment that grants +2/+2 flying and haste. You can also choose to re-equip this before your rebel dies as well. Remember Proliferate all the way back near the beginning of this video? Well, what if I were to give you another thing that is ripe for the proliferating? You've got it. Next up are oil counters. Oil counters are pretty simple. They aren't a keyword ability, they just exist. Evolved Spinoderm here is a 5/5 that enters the battlefield with 4 oil counters. At the beginning of your upkeep, you have to remove an oil counter from it. Then if it doesn't have any left, you have to sacrifice it. It also has trample if it has 2 or fewer oil counters on it, and hexproof otherwise. So if you're able to find a way to re-oil this machine before you have to sacrifice it, you'll get some nice extra use out of this beast. Our last new mechanic, which isn't technically a mechanic, just more of something that you'll see running around a lot in this set, is Phyrexian Might creature tokens. Several cards in this set create these little tokens that are essentially just 1/1 artifacts with Toxic 1 that can't block. That's about it. They'll have some extra uses though, I'm sure. With that look at the mechanics out of the way, let's take a look at our first archetype for today's video. The first archetype we will cover today is Red-White, which is advertised as a Formyridin equipment deck. We've seen this archetype before, and to be honest, it's never really materialized into anything, but we'll see if that can change here in Phyrexia as we take a look at Red-White's Signpost Uncommon Bladehold War Whip. This looks to be a bit of an equipment lord, allowing you to equip other equipment for cheaper, and the baseline stats of a 3 mana 2/2 double strike that dies into a clunky equipment is really just all upside. Let's first take a look at some of the equipment that you might want to keep an eye out for when you're drafting this deck, starting with Barbed Batterfist, which gives the creature +1/+1. Hexgold Hoverwings gives the creature flying and also buffs your other equipped creatures, including the creature equipped by the Hoverwings. Volshock Splitter grants +2/+0. Infested Flesh Cutter grants +2/+0 and makes Phyrexian Mites. Hexgold Halberd grants First Strike and Trample on your turn, and Mirren Bardiche grants +2/+1 and Vigilance. Now, what sort of creatures are you looking to equip in this deck? Well, Jawbone Duelist is a great double striker that would love a power boost. Furnace Punisher has Menace. Leonin Lightbringer gets +1/+1 whenever it's equipped. Bladegraft Aspirant has Menace and makes equipment cheaper. Swooping Lookout is a cheap evasive flyer. And Duelist of Deep Faith has First Strike on your turn, making a power boost pretty effective. Some of the rares and mythics to look out for in this archetype include Jor Kadeen, which gets huge when you have equipped creatures and can even draw you cards. Sword of Forge and Frontier, which is just an incredibly good equipment at mythic rare, even if it does give your creature protection from red. Skrelv Defector Might, which can give some of your equipped creatures unblockable. Kemba Ka Enduring cheats the cost of equipping, buffs your equipped creatures, and can make extra creatures for you. And Dragonwing Glider is essentially a 5 mana 4/4 flying haste that leaves behind a decent little, albeit expensive, equipment. Next up we have Blue-White, which is an artifact deck. Blue-White gets to dabble with artifacts quite often, so let's see if this version has the tools to compete, beginning with our Signpost Uncommon Cephalopod Sentry. Pretty simple to see what's going on here. We have a 4 mana 1/5 flyer at its base, and if you've built your deck correctly, ideally this should be at least a 4/5 or a 5/5 or bigger. Let's first take a look at some of the artifacts that you might want to include in this deck, starting with Basilica Skullbomb, which is a cheap artifact that replaces itself. Prophetic Prism is another cantripping artifact. Surgical Skullbomb also draws a card. Tamiyo's Immobilizer can control your opponent's board. Charge of the Mites can create 2 artifact creatures at instant speed. Basilica Shepherd comes with 2 artifact creatures. Swooping Lookout is a cheap evasive artifact creature. And Malkader's Watcher is a cheap evasive artifact creature that draws a card when it dies. What are some of the cards that can pay us off for having all of these artifacts in our deck? Escaped Experiment can shrink your opponent's creatures. Mandible Justiciar gets a small buff. Veil of Assimilation is almost like a recurable combat trick. Tamiyo's Lookout can draw you cards. Orthodoxy Enforcer gets bigger if you control 2 or more artifacts. Transplant Theorist lets you loot. Eye of Malkader can become a 4/4. And Plated Onslaught can buff your whole team. Some of the rares and mythics to look out for in this archetype include White Sun's Twilight, which can create a ton of artifacts all at once and even act as a board wipe. Malkader Purity Overseer, which can repeatedly create 3/3s. Skrelv's Hive creates an artifact every turn. And Unctus Grand Metatect, which pumps your artifact creatures and lets you loot. Next up we have Red-Black, and I'm sure you can guess that this will once again be a sacrifice deck. Now, this version does have a tiny twist in that this archetype also cares about oil counters. We get Red-Black Sacrifice almost every set nowadays, and honestly, it's been one of the best archetypes in most formats for a while now. Let's see if Red-Black can hang here on Phyrexia as we look at our Signpost Uncommon Char Forger. So this little guy here pays you off for building up some oil counters by sacrificing other creatures or artifacts, then lets you turn those oil counters into impulsive card draw. With any sacrifice deck comes sacrifice outlets, so let's take a look at Awaken the Sleeper, which isn't technically a sack outlet, but is this set's version of the Active Treason effect, which will be important for this deck. Cutthroat Centurion is a free sack outlet that can give itself +2/+2. Chittering Skitterling is another free sack outlet that draws cards if your opponent is corrupted, and Annihilating Glare can sack a creature or artifact to make this removal spell cost only 1 mana. So what exactly should we be sacrificing? Blightbelly Rat proliferates when it dies, Chimney Rabble dies into a 1/1, Prophetic Prism has already drawn you a card when it entered, Furnace Skullbomb can sack itself to draw a card, Dross Skullbomb can do the same thing, Fleshless Gladiator can return itself if your opponent is corrupted, and Cacophony Scamp can sacrifice itself and ping something when it does. Some of the oil counter synergies in this archetype include Vat of Rebirth, which can return creatures to your hand, Churning Reservoir, which can create 1/1s, Exuberant Fusiling, which gets bigger with oil counters, Urabrask's Anointer, which pings something on ETB based on oil counters, Forge Hammer Centurion can make creatures unable to block, Necrosquito gets bigger with oil counters, Axiom Engraver can rummage with oil counters, and Kuldotha Cackler gets a temporary buff from oil counters. Some of the rares and mythics to look out for in this archetype include Kethic Crucible Goliath, which is a free sacrifice outlet with upside. Slowbad Iron Goblin can add extra mana for you. Geth, Thane of Contracts, can return those creatures you've been sacrificing to the battlefield. And Vran Executioner Thane drains your opponent when your creatures die. Next up we have Red-Green, which is advertised as a mid-range deck focused around oil counters. Good thing mid-range just happens to be one of the better strategies in Limited. Our signpost uncommon for Red-Green is Cinderclash Ravager, which at its base is a 6-mana 5/5 Vigilance that also has the bonus text of dealing a damage to all of your opponent's creatures on ETB. And if you've got any oil counter synergies going on, this could easily be a 4-mana or even 3-mana 5/5 Vigilance, which is the real deal. There are plenty of creatures that fit fine in a mid-range deck, but a few in these colors include Cankerbloom, which has decent stats with some modal upside, Resistance Skywarden is just a big fat body with keywords, Venomous Brutalizer is a good rate for its cost and you can even pay a little extra for a little more, Chimney Rabble has haste and dies into another body, and Adaptive Spore Singer gives you a decent little modal ETB ability. Some of the oil counter synergies that exist in these colors are definitely ones that overlap with Red-Black, but we'll start with Urabrask's Anointer, which pings something on ETB based on oil counters, Armored Scrapgorger is a mana dork that can eventually become relevant with oil counters. Churning Reservoir can create 1/1s. Exuberant Fusiling gets bigger with oil counters. Magmatic Sprinter has haste and would love to gather more oil counters. Furnace Strider can give other creatures haste. Kuldotha Cackler gets a temporary boost from oil counters. And Axiom Engraver can rummage. Some of the rares and mythics to look out for in this archetype include Bloated Contaminator, which is an excellent rate for its cost. Luca, Bound to Ruin, because who doesn't love themselves a good Planeswalker in Limited? Solfim Mayhem Dominus, which is an excellent mid-range bonus. Evolved Spinoderm, which cares about oil counters and is just a 4-mana 5/5. And Miglo's Maze Crusher, which has all kinds of modality and stats for its cost. Next up we have Black-Green, which looks to be the signpost archetype of the format, as it is focused around getting that coveted poison victory. Getting your opponents to 10 poison counters will likely be a fun way to win in the format, and Black-Green looks to be the best archetype to help you get there, as we look at its signpost uncommon, Necrogen Rot Priest. The Rot Priest here wants you to be aggressive with your toxic creatures, kind of has Toxic 3 itself in a way, and can really present a quick clock for your opponent if blocking isn't in their immediate plans. Not to mention, it even has an activated ability set to punish them when they do block. We first have to figure out how to poison our opponent, and we can do just that with creatures like Bilious Skull Dweller, which has Toxic 1, Branch Blight Stalker is a 2-drop with Toxic 2, Pestilent Siphoner is a cheap evasive flyer with Toxic 1, Blightbelly Rat has Toxic 1 as well, Paladin of Predation has Toxic 6, and Nimrazor Paladin has Toxic 2 with upside. In order to get our toxic creatures through, we'll need some removal, like Annihilating Glare, which can be a very cheap removal spell. Anoint with Affliction is incredibly efficient if your opponent is corrupted. Drown in Ichor is an incredible removal spell with upside. And Infectious Bite removes a creature and poisons your opponent at the same time. Some of the rares and mythics to look out for in this archetype include Tyvar Jubilant Brawler because, again, I'll never turn down a Planeswalker in Limited. Glissa Sunslayer is an incredible value for its cost. Bloated Contaminator does everything this deck wants to do. And Vran Executioner Thane punishes your opponent whenever your creatures die. Next up is Green-White, which is a very similar deck to Black-Green, as this one is advertised as Toxic Aggro. Rather than being a bit more methodical with its poison victory like Black-Green, Green-White looks to poison your opponent out as quickly as it can with the help of its signpost uncommon, Slaughter Singer. This card looks to be pushing damage on 2 different axes, both with Toxic to increase their poison count, and with direct damage. This way, your opponent will have no clue which of their life totals they need to worry more about. We'll need to get on board early with some toxic creatures to get the poison train rolling, and we can do just that with creatures like Flensing Raptor, which is a flyer with Toxic 1, Duelist of Deep Faith has Toxic 1 and First Strike on your turn, Crawling Chorus has Toxic 1 and dies into another creature with Toxic 1, Venomous Brutalizer has Toxic 3 and nice stats, Branch Blight Stalker is a 2-drop with Toxic 2, and Jawbone Duelist has Toxic 1 and Double Strike, almost like Toxic 2. If we're going to be super aggressive trying to push our toxic creatures through, we'll need some combat tricks to back them up, like Titanic Growth, which gives +4/+4, Tyvar's Stand, which is a modal trick and protection spell, Complete Devotion, which can even let you draw a card if your creature has Toxic, Zealot's Conviction, which gives you a bonus if your opponent is corrupted, Infectious Bite, which is a removal spell and a poison counter for your opponent, and Noxious Assault, which could just end the game on the spot. Some of the rares and mythics to look out for in this archetype include Melira the Living Cure, which has a ton of text, but is basically just a 2-mana 3/3 but that protects you from your opponent's poison shenanigans. Venerated Rot Priest works very well with all the combat tricks we just talked about. Tyrannax Rex, which probably just reads as 7 mana win the game. And Bloated Contaminator, which does just about everything you want to be done in this deck. Next up is Blue-Green, which takes the best of both of the colors and combines them together to give you Proliferate Poison. Green gives you lots of ways to poison your opponent, and blue gives you access to a bunch of proliferate, so why not combine them together for the kill? Tainted Observer here is a toxic creature itself, and even lets you pay a couple of mana to proliferate every time a creature ETBs on your side, slowly draining the life out of your opponent. We'll need to get that first poison counter on our opponent before we can proliferate it, so we can do just that with creatures like Tyrannak's Atrocity, which has Toxic 3 and Haste, Ickerspit Basilisk, which has Toxic 1 and Death Touch, Unctus's Retrofitter, which has Toxic 1, Paladin of Predation, which has Toxic 6, Branch Blight Stalker, which is a 2-drop with Toxic 2, and Plague Nurse, which can give your other creatures yet another instance of Toxic. Once your opponent has that first poison counter, we'll need ways to proliferate it, and we can do just that with Mesmerizing Dose, which is a removal spell that proliferates. Copper Longlegs can sacrifice itself to proliferate. Gitaxian Anatomist can tap itself on ETB to proliferate if you so choose. Reject Imperfection is a counterspell with proliferate. Vivisurgeon's Insight is a card draw spell that proliferates. And Serum Snare is a bounce spell that proliferates. Some of the rares and mythics to look out for in this archetype include Azuri Stalker of Spheres, which is a proliferate payoff, Bloated Contaminator, which can poison your opponent and proliferate, Zopendrel Hunger Dominus, which can make your creatures huge, Tyrannak's Rex, which once again probably just wins the game when you cast it, and Tecathol Inquiry Dominus, which can let you proliferate twice as much. Next up is Blue-Black, which is actually advertised as a control deck with a proliferate sub-theme. We rarely get true control decks in Limited, so it might be kind of fun, or miserable depending on which side of the battlefield you're on, to see how this one shapes out. Let's take a look at Blue-Black's Signpost Uncommon in Voidwing Hybrid, which is a super efficiently costed creature that also has built-in recursion from your graveyard, or lethal combo. A classic control deck wouldn't be what it is without elements of control, and we have access to just that with cards like Serum Snare, which is a bounce spell, Drown in Ichor, which is a removal spell, Mesmerizing Dose, which is another removal spell, Bring the Ending, which is a counter spell, Reject Imperfection, yet another counter spell, and Anoint with Affliction, yet another removal spell. We already mentioned some of the cards that proliferate, but some of the payoffs include cards like Scheming Aspirant, which drains your opponent every time you proliferate, Gitaxian Anatomist, which can proliferate when it ETBs if you choose, Thrumming Bird, which is a cheap flyer that can proliferate when it hits, and Blightbelly Rat, which proliferates when it dies. Some of the rares and mythics to look out for in this archetype include Kaito Dancing Shadow because Planeswalkers, Venser Corpse Puppet, which gives you bonuses when you proliferate, Vran Executioner Thane, which can drain your opponent if your creatures were to die, Phyrexian Arena, which lets you draw 2 cards per turn, and Blue Sun's Twilight, which can steal your opponent's creatures. Next up is Blue-Red, which combines a classic archetype in non-creature spells with a new mechanic in oil counters. We get Blue-Red spells quite often nowadays, and this version should likely continue in its predecessor's footsteps. Our signpost uncommon for this archetype is Serum Core Chimera, which allows you to build up oil counters in a similar way that the red-black card did, and then use those oil counters to remove creatures from the other side of the battlefield. We'll first need a high density of non-creature spells, and some of those include cards like Free from Flesh, which is a combat trick that can give you oil counters. Distorted Curiosity is divination with upside. Thrill of Possibility is a classic instant speed card draw spell. Vivisurgeon's Insight also draws you some cards. Blazing Crescendo is a combat trick with some impulsive card draw tacked on. And Prologue to Phyresis is a cheap cantrip with upside. Some of the oil counter synergies in this archetype include Furnace Strider, which can give your creatures haste, Timio's Immobilizer, which is kind of like a removal spell, Urabrask's Anointer, which can ping something on ETB based on oil counters, Ichor Synthesizer, which gets a bonus when you cast non-creature spells and cares about the oil counters on it, Sawblade Scamp, which can ping your opponent if you give it oil counters, and Forge Hammer Centurion, which can make creatures unable to block. Some of the rares and mythics to look out for in this archetype include Ovika Enigma Goliath, which creates more creatures when you cast non-creature spells, Mercurial Spelldancer, which can let you copy instants and sorceries and can't be blocked, and Vindictive Flamestoker, which can give you some much needed card draw later in the game. Our last archetype in today's video is Black-White, which cares about getting your opponents corrupted. Maybe the full 10 poison needed to kill your opponent is just barely out of reach, but if you can get just 3, you'll get tons of bonuses. Our signpost uncommon, Vivisection Evangelist, is an insanely good payoff for getting your opponent corrupted, as it straight up destroys another creature if they are. We'll need to start with some creatures that can get our opponent those first few poison counters, and we can do that with cards like Blightbelly Rat, which has Toxic 1, Annex Sentry, which has Toxic 1 and can remove something, Flensing Raptor is a flyer with Toxic 1, Bilious Skulldweller has Death Touch and Toxic 1, Duelist of Deep Faith has Toxic 1 and First Strike on your turn, and Pestilent Siphoner has Toxic 1 and Flying. Next, we need to focus on some of the payoffs for getting our opponent corrupted with cards like Bonepicker Scourge, which gets Death Touch and Lifelink, Incisor Glider, which can buff your whole squad, Fleshless Gladiator, which can return itself from the graveyard, Ravenous Necrotitan, which can be a 4-mana 6/6 with no downside, and Apostle of Invasion that can get Double Strike. Some of the rares and mythics to look out for in this archetype include Skrelv's Hive, which can make a toxic creature every single turn for you, Skrelv himself, which can give your toxic creatures unblockable, Kaya Intangible Slayer, because, again, Planeswalkers, and Rhea Ivor Bane of Bladehold, which can pump your team and make you more toxic creatures if you choose. Thanks so much for sticking around until the end of this video if you're still here. I'm always excited for the release of this video because I know it'll be very beneficial for you all to have this information in one place so that you have an easy way to find what you need if you wish to revisit the video throughout the week. If you enjoyed this content, feel free to share it with a friend or two, as there's a decent chance they might as well. If you're already subscribed to the channel, thanks so much for being here today, and if you're not, go ahead and click that subscribe button to stay on top of set review season and have access to consistent, high-quality drafts as soon as the set launches on Arena. Looks like that'll do it for today's video, and I'll see you next time here at Daily Draft.